Hello and welcome to the Japan Archives, a podcast where we'll be delving into the histories and mythologies from Japan's long history. I'm your host, Thomas.
And I'm your co-host, Heather. We'll also be reading a poem for you every week and giving a little history about the poet who wrote it. Ikimashou!
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Japan Archives. We are on episode 41, and today we have a very special episode. We are going to be talking about Hokusai. So, Thomas, before we get started, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. I have to go back to school tomorrow for 3 hours because they want the teachers being in school on rotation. Yeah, how about you?
Doing pretty good. It feels like summer right now for your weather report. The weather is sunny and it feels quite like summer. Very lovely. And the pollen is kind of going down. So that's great. That is so wonderful. I'm going to turn it back over to you because I don't, my topic is at the end. I think you're the one that has all of the beautiful, lovely research. And I'm so excited to hear it. When you suggested this idea, I was just, beside myself.
Yeah, so I wanted to do Hokusai today. Like we said last week, we were still waiting on the Cherry book again. But it is here now. So the surprise episode for today was Hokusai. I'm not going to ask you today what you already know. I feel like this is something you know a bit about. You've been to the exhibitions and stuff, so I'm just going to get straight into it for everyone. Hokusai is the name that we know him most of all by. But when he was born in 1760, his given name was actually Tokitaro. He was born, some believe, somewhere in the vicinity of Warigesui section of the Honjo district in Edo. I'm not quite sure where the Honjo district is, though. It doesn't ring a bell, so I'm not sure if it no longer exists today in Tokyo. But when he was born, people believe that his father was actually a mirror maker, known by the name of Nakajima Ise, and he was a man who produced mirrors for the shogun. So I suppose he was quite a man of renown back in his time. But it turns out that Hokusai was never actually made an heir of his father. So it's believed that probably his mother was a concubine. Around the age of 6, that's when we find Hokusai began his painting, so he started quite early on. And at the age of 12, his father sent him to work in a bookshop and lending library, which at the time was a popular institute in Japanese cities, where reading books made from the traditional woodblock prints was a popular entertainment for the middle and upper classes at the time. And then, if we jump to the age of 16 for him, we find that he was apprenticed as an engraver, where he spent 3 years learning the trade. And it was during this time that he began to produce his own illustrations instead of the paintings that he was doing from age 6. So that's all I really know about his early life. It's not too much, I'm afraid, but I think it's safe to say from around the age of 18, that's when we start seeing Hokusai as we know him today. So at the age of 18, we see that he's enrolled in a studio owned by a Katsukawa Shunsho. And it was while he was apprenticed here that he decided that he wanted to start making a reputation for himself as a designer of actor prints at the time. So not quite the art that we would necessarily associate with him. If you say, who is Hokusai? You would normally say Mount Fuji. But he initially started with his actor prints. We could probably say that this man was a little eccentric over his lifetime. We do know that he moved a total of 93 times during his life from place to place. He even made a giant Daruma painting, which was over 200 meters squared. He changed his name many times during his life. In fact, we know of over 30 different names that he did use, and historically they are now used to establish different periods within Hokusai's lifetime.
So essentially, the different name changes may have coincided with a different technique or style or a theme he wished to portray.
Yes, I think it's safe to say that. Like, I will a little later on, I'm going to talk about like certain names that he used for different styles and things. You'll also see later on that there are some name changes that were due to him reaching a certain age in his lifetime,
Mm.
but we'll get into that momentarily.
The choice of Hokusai, do we know why he chose that name?
From what I could tell, he chose his name, Hokusai, as it means North Studio. And the name was an abbreviation of Hokushinsai, which was North Star
Ah,
Studio.
okay. So even though he's changed his name several times, we know him by Hokusai was because that was his first known artistic name?
Not necessarily. See, you're
Hmm.
touching on things I'm going to talk about.
Oh, I'm fast. Okay, well then I will patiently wait.
So yeah, his name Hokusai means North Star based on the word for North Star Studio. I'm not exactly sure what the significance of this name was for him, but he did pick his name based off of Hokushinsai.
Hmm.
Yes. Now, during his time when he was apprenticed to Shunso, this is where we find his earliest pieces of work. However, it's sad to say that he didn't have much success initially for over a decade. And so we find that in the early 1790s, so he's aged 35 now, he left the school he was at to go learn various other different painting techniques, to expand his repertoire. And it was in 1796 that we finally begin to see the name of Hokusai being used in his art. And this is when he also tried to establish his own style of art that he's well known for today. Now he's changed his name to Hokusai. I can answer your question about the names. So he used the name Hokusai during these times for items that were prints and paintings. He would use the name Tatsumasa for certain private collections. We find him using his given name, Tokitaro, for
Ah.
illustrations and commercial fiction. So Hokusai wasn't his first artistic name.
Mm.
And he also used names such as Kako or Sorobeku for other commercial prints and books. Hokusai is also said to have had an interest in poetry, which I'm sure you'll be very happy about, Heather. And the poetry he was very particular about was called Senryu, which was a comical form of haiku.
Mm.
Due to his connections to these poetry circles, he did create for them non-commercial prints and plates to go inside their poetry albums, which were known in Japanese as the Kyoka Ehon. It's even said that during his lifetime, he liked to give public demonstrations of his work. I assume it was to increase his fame and help people get to know him more as an artist. But again, he also only started to do this later on in his life when he was already quite well known. So perhaps he didn't do it for the fame. He was just wanted to show people who he was or something.
Maybe it's just a different form of art, like a performance art. So to explore at a
All
different
that, yeah.
stage of life, yeah.
So this is where I'm going to start jumping through various different years of his life. 1804. We see some of his successes. At this time, he had become the foremost illustrator of popular novels, but life as an illustrator wasn't always that easy for him. There were a few jobs, one in particular where it said he ended up in a major dispute with one of the writers who was then subsequently replaced. So they kept on Hokusai for his art, but replaced the writer for a new one. So I'm kind of assuming from this, Hokusai was a man who wasn't scared to stand his ground to make sure his ideas were listened to, perhaps. From the early 1810s. So we're already in his mid 50s now, and he's still working. And we see his style becoming more defined and kind of more of his own. During this time, a series of books that he said was for those who wanted to learn drawing in the Hokusai style. Now, this book in question is known as the Hokusai manga, or Sketches by Hokusai. It actually came about and was inspired by a man known as Bokusen, a man who Hokusai would make a lifelong friendship with.
So the manga listed here, like Hokusai manga, that's not quite the manga of today, is it? Or is it a little different?
Hokusai, when he called it his Hokusai manga, it was one of the earliest records we have for using this term, but aesthetically, it is quite different from the modern equivalent. It was just a very early form of manga and has definitely changed a lot since then. It's now more commonly associated to a style that was developed in the 19th century. So Hokusai's style does predate it as we know it today, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Now, Japan, at the time, I think, well, even now, it does hold a lot of beliefs or similarities with China at times, and they both had this belief in the 60-year cycle, which related to the zodiac. And due to this is another reason why Hokusai changed his name. So at the end of his first 60-year cycle, he started a new kanreki, or beginning of a new cycle. So in 1820, when he turned 61, he changed his name again to Itsu. Hokusai was not the name that he was known by towards the end of his life. It was more of a middle career name, but it is the name he is most famous for. But yeah, that is definitely not the last name that he ever used in his life. From 1820, when he changed his name, from what I was reading, it appears he had a little break from his career until 1828. So a few years. And this was until after the death of his second wife. From what I can tell, this was his second wife. I'm not sure when he married her or when he married his first wife, but during his lifetime, he did actually have 2 sons and 3 daughters with these women. One of his daughters was known as Katsushika Oe, and she was also a skillful painter, and she was skillful in the art known as bijinga, or beautiful woman art pieces. These pieces you can see have dramatic contrasts between light and dark, but sadly we only have a few pieces of them, and unfortunately due to that we really don't know that much about her. So after the death of his wife, it's said that the following year, in 1829, his grandson started giving him some troubles, he gave him some problems, and to remedy this, 1 year later in 1830, he gets his son-in-law to take his grandson away from him and sends them off to a province in Japan. He sends them off to Michinoku province. All of these problems his grandson were giving him, perhaps this could have been seen as an omen for bad news for Hokusai, and 1830 did kind of become a bad year for him. He did write at the time, "This new year, not a penny to spend, no clothes to put on, nor anything to eat." And it was this year that he found himself having to ask for work that he could complete. So during this year, he completed a silk painting, as well as the second volume of a book called the Shippen Sui Ko Gaden, which was a Japanese translation of a Chinese classic. And this volume, again, would not be published for another 4.5 years. So, though he did the work, he still had to wait for its finalization. So, overall, 1830 may have been a bad year for Hokusai. So, if we look to the following year, did anything improve for Hokusai? Well, in 1831, this is when we see the first announcement being made for the 36 views of Mount Fuji. Hokusai now is 72 years old and he's still painting. So his most famous piece wasn't until way later on in his life. This art series was announced by his publisher at the time, Nishinuraya Yohachi. Now these announcements, these adverts that were made, they were advertised using 2 of Hokusai's names actually. So perhaps people were not quite aware of his change of name, or perhaps he changed them so much people found it hard to keep up. So the adverts said that these prints would be designed by Old Itsu, formerly known as Hokusai. And these adverts were placed in the back of popular novels over the coming years to basically try and get the word out about them as much as possible.
So they advertised him as the artist formerly known as Hokusai.
Formerly known as Hokusai, yet we know him as Hokusai to this day.
Apparently everyone else kind of knew him as Hokusai, apparently.
Furthermore, when these adverts, they were described as views of Mount Fuji from various locations, printed in shades of blue, and possibly numbering a total of 100 or more designs. This announcement of having a series of artwork was deemed a good move because at the time there were a lot of avid art collectors, and by Advertising that it would be a series of artwork, it would ensure that these people would inevitably try to buy the complete set, meaning more money for Hokusai, but also more money for his publisher to keep his business running. I think it's safe to say that over 100 designs is rather a large task to undertake, especially in color, like these ones were. And as we know, this never actually occurred. And in the end, the series became known as the 36 Views of Mount Fuji. Although, ironically, there are 46 of them, not 36 prints. So the reason they're not called the 46 Views of Mount Fuji, the number 36, historically, it seems to have always held some kind of cultural significance in Japan. The idea of 36 being equivalent to, I suppose, 100%. This number is a collection of everything that is of import. So 36 Views of Mount Fuji, they also use it historically for groups of poets. So you had the 36 poetic geniuses, the best poets at the time. They also wrote one which was the 36 women poetic geniuses. Apparently also, I'm not sure if it's true or if it is a belief in Japan, but the carp fish was also said to have only had 36 scales on its body. And due to the carp being important in Japan, this only added to the number 36 being culturally significant to the Japanese. It was this artwork where we see Hokusai trying to achieve almost a three-dimensional image through the use of the different layered colors on the woodblock prints using only a 2D medium. And of these designs, when you look at the signature, the inkan upon them, we can see that 10 of them do predate all of the others. One of these 10 does include the Great Wave of Kanagawa, which was signed as Aratame Itsu, which we can translate to by Hokusai, changing his name to Itsu. And the rest of his prints were signed with a different name, which was Zen Hokusai Itsu, which can translate to by Itsu, formerly known as Hokusai. So Hokusai was always trying to adapt and to change. And so around this time, we also see him beginning to paint something known as kachoga, which is pictures of birds and flowers. And Hokusai, being as innovative as he tried to be, he changed how they were to be depicted. Now, people would often have done them in upright, narrow designs, whereas Hokusai decided to flip that and change it. And he did them horizontally. Because of his change, this allowed an unconventional close-up of what was being depicted as if you were looking at it through a telescope. So it changed how people saw this type of artwork. His renewed popularity now in 1831 meant that he was also commissioned to paint a design of two carp motifs among water weeds on a series of fan prints at the time. In 1832, we see another set of prints appearing by Hokusai. This is a smaller series. There was only 9 of them in total, 3 for Tokyo, 3 for Osaka, and 3 for Kyoto. And for each city, each print was given a different theme. So we had the theme of snow, the themes of cherry blossoms, and the theme of the moon, which were used to depict the different seasons. So you would have had winter, you would have had spring, and you would have had autumn. I'm not sure why there was not a summer print done for these cities. I'm not sure if it was symbolic to only have those 3 seasons, so I'll have to look more into that.
Well, I mean, I guess you only have 3 cities, so 3 themes, perhaps? So maybe 3, 3, and 3.
Yeah, 3 for 3. That's a good assumption. Yeah.
Maybe he just didn't like mosquitoes and didn't like summer because it's too hot.
Yeah, yeah. The mosquitoes here are horrible. I hate them so much. Additionally, in 1832, there was a visit from the king of the Ryukyu Islands at the time, and they had a procession through the city. The Ryukyu Islands being the island chain south of Japan, which include Okinawa. This visit from the Ryukyu Islands led to a surge in interest, the islands and the people who lived there, and so Hokusai took and adapted art from a Chinese book which had been made on these islands already, and he had this artwork published in broadsheets at the time, entitling them as the 8 Views of the Ryukyu Islands. All of this sudden work seems to have re-inspired and almost reawoken Hokusai to the world of art, and we see from now on much more being created by him. He went back to his Hokusai manga, and by now there were 12 volumes of them, with his most recent ones attempting to show the more humorous side of him. In 1834, we see adverts now appearing for the remarkable views of bridges in all provinces, this being a series of 10 pieces in the end. There was a 11th piece added at a later date, but it is likely that this was requested by someone. And it was in this same year that we see the first published volume of the 100 views of Mount Fuji. So ironically, he did in the end do a series of work on 100 views of Mount Fuji. However, all of these pieces of work were monochromatic in nature, unlike their colorful predecessors. Volume 2 of this compilation did come out the following year, and this did include the first instance of Hokusai's autobiography, where he again announced a change of name, this time from Itsu to Gakyorojin Manji, or Manji the Old Man Mad with Painting. Sadly, the third and final volume of the 100 Views was slightly delayed due to the bankruptcy of his publisher, but it was eventually published at a later date. And still, Hokusai did not stop his work. In 1835, he began a large 3-volume book centered around famous warriors, and soon after that came his largest collection to date. This collection was known as 100 Poems Explained by a Wet Nurse, and I'm particularly interested in this one, and I'm sure Heather is, as the 100 poems in question are those from our probably favorite poetry book right now, the Ogura Hyakuin Issue. Hokusai endeavored to give each poem its own print, as interpreted by a wet nurse, in which Hokusai created the art by paraphrasing the poem and freely associating single words from them to make his final image. Sadly, only 27 of these were taken to print, but we are fortunate in that copies of his designs have survived, meaning we could recreate the remaining 73 which were never printed.
And I actually have seen, I think, a couple of these. There was the Hokusai exhibit I went to last year, and the professor pointed out the words in the portraits or pictures.
So he hides the words in the picture.
Yeah, it's not so hidden. Like you can still make them out, but I mean with kanji. So as you're more familiar with kanji and like some of the, I guess the older kanji as well, you would be able to see them. Like you can tell there's definitely something built into the picture. And you said the 100 is by a wet nurse, but the translation in the museum was just nurse. So I don't like I'm intrigued that there's a different category of nurse versus just wet nurse, which is a specific kind of nurse. So I'm curious, like, if that's the translation, like why the translations is a little bit different, because it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, the book I used did say wet nurse. I do remember once reading that at the time, at least historically back then, wet nurses were more common. I know a lot of the emperors, they had their own wet nurses and things. But again, like we keep coming back to, maybe it's something just to do with translation preferences or something like that. I'm not too sure. But after this large publication of work, there would have been smaller things now and then for sure, but it does seem that publication overall may have stopped. There were no more prints to be made. Nothing more was forthcoming after this. So sometime in his mid-80s, we do know that whilst he was doing all of that extensive work, he visited the town known as Obuse, which is close to Nagano. He was invited there by a man known as Takai Kozan, and during his time there, he created a few more artistic pieces. These ones known as Dragon and Phoenix, as well as another called Masculine Waves and Feminine Waves. And these two pieces of art were made for the ceiling of 2 different festival floats. In addition to this, he also created a phoenix for the ceiling of the temple of Gansho-in. Finally, drawing towards the end of his life, in 1836, Hokusai returned back to Tokyo after his many moves everywhere else, to find it ravaged by famine at the time, and so he had to resort to selling pitchers for measures of rice to survive. Sadly, in 1848, his lodgings at the time did burn down, which did take all of his study sketches and painting materials with him. So any artwork that he had that had never been seen before, unfortunately, it has been lost. And in the following year, in 1849, Hokusai finally passed away. And you can find his grave to this day in Tokyo at the temple of Seikyoji, which is a mere 10-minute walk from Ueno Station.
The next time we can go to Tokyo, we're going to have to go take a look.
If you are interested, Heather, or anyone listening, in seeing some of his artwork, obviously there are many museums around the world which do house them. However, for a more, I suppose, Hokusai experience, I would personally recommend going to the town of Obuse that we just mentioned. A short train ride from Nagano Station. There you can visit the Hokusai Museum. And it's full of his works, including one of the festival floats he actually painted. And they also have a very good video with English subtitles, going even more into depth into the life of Hokusai than I did today. And with that, I wanted to end with a little quote from Hokusai, which I came across actually at this museum when I visited with my parents, and the quote goes as follows. From the age of 6, I had a mania for drawing the shapes of things. When I was 50, I had published a universe of designs, but for all I have done before the age of 70 is not worth bothering with. At 75, I'll have learned something of the pattern of nature, of animals, of plants, of trees, birds, fish, and insects. When I am 80, you will see real progress. At 90, I shall have cut my way deeply into the mystery of life itself. At 100, I shall be a marvelous artist. At 110, everything I create, a dot, a line, will jump to life as never before. To all of you who are going to live as long as I do, I promise to keep my word. I am writing this in my old age. I used to call myself Hokusai, but today I sign myself the old man mad about drawing.
I feel like sometimes you look at art, you have to take a few minutes to appreciate, to soak in everything. I'm not a good art analysis. I'm not good at art analysis, but I really enjoyed kind of getting an idea of the man behind the artworks. I mean, walking through, seeing the different prints he did and different stages of his life. We essentially got the sense of just, Hokusai as the person, like doing things over a short amount of time, but it's really throughout his whole entire life, and things changed, and he never settled. He never considered himself finished as an artist. I think he possibly, since he died before he was 110, I'm assuming he thought he still was unfinished.
I think he always believed there was always something else to learn. Like, no matter how long you've been doing something, you can always improve upon it.
I love this because I mean, I knew a little bit about him, but definitely not to the extent of what you've shared. So, and just like good art, I'm going to appreciate it, let it soak in, and think about it for a long time. And I hope we revisit Hokusai, because I feel like there's a lot more we could probably say about him. This is really fascinating. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for all that research too. That was quite a bit of research you did, and I feel like you really have a ton more that you could have put in.
Well, don't thank me. Thank Alfredo. It was his suggestion this week to do Hokusai. I was asking him a few things that he was interested in, and he mentioned Hokusai. And I know we've talked to some of our listeners before through our website or through Twitter, and some of them have also said they wanted to do a bit on artwork or artists. So I think it fitted in well today for our surprise impromptu episode.
Well, Alfredo and dear listeners, and dear Alfredo, thank you so much for the suggestion, because I thoroughly enjoyed it. Please give more suggestions. I love learning new stuff.
Is today, Heather, a poem, a song, animal, vegetable, mineral? What do you have?
Well, Thomas, today we have a poem. And a little birdie told me last night. I don't know where this birdie came from, but he just kind of came to me via a phone call and shared with me an interesting fact about like Hokusai and a type of poem called Sinyu. And had my idea for a topic poem, but that changed my idea. But then during the course of the time from when I was told about Sinyu to doing the actual research, I forgot the name Sinyu. So I have a poem instead that I feel is a little bit inspired by Hokusai in a way, but we're going to start with the name of the poet, and his name is Mukai Kanetoki. He was born in Nagasaki in 1651, and he started to train as a samurai, but he changed his profession when he was 23 to write poetry instead. He published haiku and he edited haiku collections because he was a student of Basho. Now, the works that he published included the Kyorai Sho, which could be said to be translated to Conversations with Kyorai. Now, more can be said about him, but I feel like since he is a student of Basho, we're going to have to come back to him again at a later date.
Okay.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the poet, but I'm going into a theme. There's a topic theme called Sabi. Now, I am a novice in learning poetry, and this is a little bit different kind of style that I'm used to. Generally, we kind of focus on a poet and then the poetry based from the poet, but this time I'm looking at an actual theme. So Sabi is a noun, and it's taken from the word sabishi. Now, Thomas, based on this word, what do you think this theme is about?
Sabishi is the idea of isolation or loneliness. So I suppose Kanetoki poem for today revolves around the theme of loneliness to some regard.
Yeah, you're right. The topic sabi is about like loneliness, being forlorn, miserable, sad. What other adjectives that you can add to that?
His poem today is on the theme of Sabi, so loneliness. Is this a theme that Kanetoki used exclusively, or is it just one theme of many that his poems drew upon?
So, from my understanding, and again, I'm a novice. I'm learning along with you guys. You're sharing my learning. I hesitate to say journey, but my learning meanderings. There we go, meanderings. I believe he wrote on several different topics. I know because we have the poetry contest that people wrote specific topics on specific themes, but it wasn't the specific theme they spent their entire lives learning. I'm assuming based on my current knowledge, which again is limited. If anyone has more information, please share with me. I love to learn. They wrote on different themes, maybe even different time points in their life. Maybe they spent some time learning a specific thing and then they switched to something else. Now, the thing is though, I could have chosen like Sabi as the topic and then found a poet that kind of portrays this typical, because I mean, it was talked about. Sabi as a theme was around for several years. However, Mukai was a student of Basho, and as we've come to learn, Basho doesn't always stay on the same path as everyone else. He turns some of the more conventional ideas into something else. So we're talking about Sabi. However, Mukai turned the topic theme into a lighter meaning. So it's a topic of sadness, but on a lighter, more humorous bent.
Okay, I'm looking forward to the poem then, if he's somehow trying to change the idea slightly.
Yes, it said that Basho really loved this haiku. He really loved this poem. So if you're ready with your pencil and paper,
I am.
Hanamori ya shiroki kashira o tsukiawase. So Thomas, did you hear any words that you recognized?
I think the poem involves flowers of some regard. I think the first word was flower. And then after that, I heard Moria. And my brain instantly went back to Moria Sennan and his Jisei, his death poem. But perhaps it's a different word than the Moria from last time. The rest I'm not too sure about, but perhaps towards the end you said ski as in to light, but perhaps I also misheard that one or slightly.
Well, let me give you the translation because you definitely have flower and you'll recognize another word. It could be my pronunciation as well, which is also a work in progress. Blossom guards put their white heads together to talk.
So for my interpretation of the poem, it gives me the idea of every flower is in isolation, it's its own thing. However, they crave company, and so they're turning their heads to each other so they can see one another and not be lonely. A bit like sunflowers do in the wild. Sunflowers naturally turn towards the sun, but if the sun's not around, they turn towards each other. So that's the idea I was getting from that.
I like that. I liked your interpretation, which is something I like about poetry. I think, like art, sometimes it can be interpreted by the listener or the viewer in ways that are pleasing to them. Now, the interpretation I have for the interpretation is that the blossom guards are referring to old men who are putting their talking together, so getting close together, and they've all got white hair, so they're coming together under the cherry trees to talk together. So the contrast is between the oji-sans, which is like the older men, usually over like elderly gentlemen, under the cherry blossoms, which usually symbol youth and youngness and youthivity. Oh, good lord. Cherry blossoms usually symbolize youth. So you have the old men with their white hairs with the cherry blossoms with their white heads all together. So the contrast of the old and the young, but also pointing out, because the men are getting older, it's pointing out the human aging process, but in a very nice way.
Rather different to what I said.
Well, it's different than what I would have assumed too, because I would have thought perhaps that the flowers too were chatting together or talking together. So I think that the idea, you got the loneliness in there, but it's kind of referring to the loneliness of kind of getting older, but not quite so like that desolate sometimes, where you get the aging process can sometimes be more seen as like declining and like a more negative thing. This is more lighthearted, just kind of pointing out the difference between the two. So I chose this poem because it had that idea of aging, but not aging in a scene so much in a really negative way. And that's because, talking about Hokusai, something interesting I found was that Hokusai really didn't become famous until he was around or over 60. And it's really interesting. So that kind of got me thinking about getting older and how generally the ideal of like the beauty of youth, not just being beautiful, but being the beauty of youth, and how youth is this wonderful ideal. And then after you've aged, you start aging, like it kind of becomes a decline and a negative thing. But however, like Hokusai really didn't become famous and popular and prolific, and he even said himself he wasn't done. So that idea of the beauty of being young is pretty much universally loved. It's used in a lot of different themes, but like we see with Hokusai, that talent and creativity and accomplishment doesn't always come from the young. Age brings with it wealth of experience and wisdom. Now, that's not to say that being young is not having the capability of great things. Truly great things have been done by those who are young as well. What I like to think instead is that sometimes there is this fear of growing older. But just because you grow older, you shouldn't just sit back, relax on all the knowledge and wisdom that you've learned. Instead, you should always want to keep growing and learning. No matter how old you get, you still have that capability to learn and grow. So I think it's a beautiful thing. I think enjoy youth. Enjoy it. It's a wonderful time, but also enjoy being older, because there's a lot of wonderful things with that. And to appreciate all the stages in your life and everyone's life, just to appreciate and realize they're different, but that you can do and accomplish so many things at any point in your life. And Thomas, like you, I want to end my segment today with the quote you gave from Hokusai, but I'm just going to use a tiny little bit. When I am 80, you will see real progress.
It's a good quote to end on.
Thank you. So, Thomas, any questions today or anything you'd like to add?
Not at all. I really liked listening to your thoughts just then on aging and constantly learning. It was really insightful, and I agree with it 100%. I mean, that's kind of why we do this now. Like, it started off as a fun thing to do, but the more we do it, the more it's learning more, it's fun, it's interesting, and you realize that it doesn't matter how old you are, you can still learn more. There's always more time than you think as well to achieve your goals.
You are so very welcome. Thank you so much for talking about Hokusai. Oh, I'm so happy right now.
You're very welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
So next week we are doing cherry blossoms, right?
Finally, we will do the cherry blossoms. I want to talk about a man known as Collingwood Ingram. However, he did get the nickname Cherry due to his obsession with Japanese cherry blossoms, so we're going to call him Cherry Ingram. And it's the story about the Englishman who saved Japan's blossoms. But I'll say no more, and we will learn about it next week.
Looking forward to it. Finally, the cherry blossom book has arrived.
And I'm looking forward to whatever you come up with next week, whether it be a cherry blossom themed item or a Senryu, because Hokusai liked them. We'll have, well, I guess we'll find out.
Sinyu. I'm aiming for Sinyu. We'll see.
Okay.
It could be a mystery, but the current plan is I really want to see Sinyu.
Okay, well, that sounds good to me. So as ever, thank you everyone for tuning in. This week, there will be a bonus episode coming next week again for you. We found a short little folk tale, which I want to get into with Heather. And so until Wednesday, that is everything from me.
That's everything for me for now.
Okay then, guys, we'll speak to you next week. Mata ne.
皆さん気をつけて。またね。
If you've enjoyed the Japan archives, please consider checking out historyofjapan.co.uk, a database we are making on Japanese history. You can also find the show notes for all our episodes here. If you're on Instagram, you can follow my account over at nexus_travels, that's NEXUS_travels.
We also have a Facebook and Twitter page, which you can find at Japan Archives. If you're interested in little slices of life in Japan, be sure to check out my website over at heatheroveryonder.com. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, have anything you'd love to hear about, head on over to historyofjapan.co.uk and send us a message.
If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to give us a rating and review over on iTunes. Thank you again for listening, guys. Until next time, bye.
Mata ne!